All right, hello. We are going to be breaking up these parts of a sentence notes into two videos, one dealing with notes pages 1 and notes pages 2, and then video 2 will be for pages 3 and 4. A number of these concepts you probably already know. Some of it will be review, some of it will be necessary newness. The first concept that we're taking a look at today is this idea of a sentence. You might be thinking to yourself, like, really? A sentence? I already know what that is. But of course, when you break it down, the sentence expresses a complete thought. It's an entire thought. In fact, we use a test known as the "it could be true that" test in order to determine whether or not something is a complete thought and thus a complete sentence. So it works like this. In some universe, or even in reality, if it passes the "it could be true that" test, it sounds like it's something that could be true. So for instance, it could be true that the paper is stuck in the copier. It sounds like something that could be true, that the paper is stuck in the copier. And in fact, in this case, yeah, that works. It could be true that the paper is stuck in the copier, and we would say that's a complete sentence. It expresses a complete thought. It passes the "it could be true that" test. It could be true that I sleep, which also works. It could be true that I sleep. And in fact, what ends up happening here is that this is about as short as a sentence can possibly be. And what we're saying with the "it could be true that" test is that you can hear the sentence's subject and verb. That's really why something passes the "it could be true that" test, is because you can hear subject and verb. It's what happens up and above as well. It could be true that the paper is stuck in the copier. We can hear the sentence's subject and verb. It could be true that grinding down the street on rollerblades. It could be true that grinding down the street on rollerblades. And you may hear that sounds different than it could be true that the paper is stuck in the copier. It could be true that grinding down the street on rollerblades. And in this case, if you can imagine a big red X going, because this one does not pass the "it could be true that" test. What it's missing is like something along the lines of a subject and a verb. We don't have anybody who's doing anything, as we do in the examples above, or something that's doing something. A quick fix for this to make it work might be something along the lines of Sarah, and then we need a verb like grinded. It could be true that Sarah grinded down the street on rollerblades. Now, that's something that passes the "it could be true that" test. That's something that gives us a solid subject and a solid verb. So it won't be the last time you hear the "it could be true that" test. Speaking of fragments, since we just saw one in the grinding down the street on rollerblades example, fragment, it's not a complete thought, meaning it's not a complete sentence. It doesn't pass the what's known as the ICBTT test, the "it could be true that" test. And the reason why it's not a complete sentence and it doesn't pass the "it could be true that" test is because, as we saw above, the fragment lacks either a subject or a verb, or up above in grinding down the street on rollerblades, it has neither one of them. It has neither a subject nor a verb. Thus, the fragment is not a complete sentence. Try these examples out on your own. You can pause the video as soon as I show you this one example. But in terms of, does it pass the "it could be true that" test? A check mark is kind of like a ding, 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 ding. An X is kind of like, bah, meaning it doesn't work. So in this case, it could be true that without a raincoat on a wet day does not work. If you pause the video now, you can try these next two on your own. Okay, look, if you pause the video, then you probably realize that it could be true that dressed in a suit and black leather shoes also does not pass the "it could be true that" test. But it could be true that Jack walked down the street and the ding, 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 ding sound works, because this one does pass the "it could be true that" test. And the reason why is because we have a legitimate subject and verb. It could be true that Jack walked. That's about as much as we need to pass the it could be true that test. So 2 do not, 1 does. As far as modifiers go, it's not a lot of fun putting the actual vocabulary word in the definition, but there's really no better word. It's a modifier is a word or group of words that modifies, or if you need to, something along the lines of describes. There's a whole bunch. You probably heard some of these before, like adjectives and adverbs specifically. Those are modifiers. Like in this example, your image in your mind of just a regular old painting becomes different when we modify it with the word beautiful. A regular old painting is a different vision or a modified vision than a beautiful painting. Whole phrases like in the middle can be modifiers as well. Try the next one. You probably need an ly word, I would imagine, to modify the way in which she outran her opponent. And maybe you came up with something along the lines of quickly or barely or hardly. She outran her opponent versus quickly outrunning her opponent are 2 slightly different versions. She outran her opponent and she barely outran her opponent. Those are modified versions of one another. And then some phrases. Large phrases like including 2 bass that tested our muscles in this case. We caught some fish, including 2 bass that tested our muscles. This whole phrase modifies the fish. Regular fish and then some fish that really fought are modified versions of one another. The embedded modifier is introduced first. We do have 2 kinds of modifiers. This first kind is the embedded modifier, and the key is that it's not set off, from the rest of the sentence by marks of punctuation, meaning you don't need any marks of punctuation in order to use it. Like if you had the sentence here, it could be true that I walked with Becky. I mean, that passes the it could be true that test all by itself. But if we added this phrase in the middle, like I walked on the sidewalk with Becky, you wouldn't say I walked, comma, on the sidewalk, comma, with Becky. We would just embed it or just jam it right in there. And it would read just like that. I walked on the sidewalk with Becky. You don't need any marks of punctuation to use the word wonderful in this case. I mean, we could have the eyes of Ty tore at my heart, but using the word wonderful to modify eyes doesn't require any marks of punctuation. Nor does the word viciously to modify the way in which the eyes tore at the heart. No marks of punctuation are needed. That's the whole idea behind an embedded modifier. However, as we head into page 2 here, our last page in this particular video, we're heading toward really what this program is all about, and this idea about a free modifier. And the free modifier is a little bit different. It is set off from the rest of the sentence by marks of punctuation, meaning that this is where an understanding and a paying attention to of the marks of punctuation become really important. And we'll see that in just a moment. And the other biggie, and this is the biggie, like if you're going to have two new best friends that are concepts in English class, like base clause and free modifier are going to be them. And the base clause is, it's the main part of the sentence. It always, always, always passes the it could be true that test. And what that means is that, the base clause has the subject and it has the verb in it. The reason why it passes the it could be true that test is because of it. And there is this little, love story going on between subject and verb. They're always together anytime they can be in the base clause. In this next step, it may look a little different than what you see on your piece of paper if this document hasn't been updated already. But as far as the key goes, what's going to end up happening here is as we analyze the sentences below, we're going to be underlining what's considered base clause. We're going to be identifying the subject and the verb by putting an S in a V over the subject and the verb. We're going to be circling marks of punctuation. And when we say marks of punctuation, we're really talking about ground level marks of punctuation. There are some that are up in the air, like for instance, the quotation mark is up in the air. These are not the ones that we're going to be talking about though. Apostrophes are up in the air. It's going to be the ones that are like ground level marks of punctuation or ones that hover. So some of the most common ones is the comma, the period, the question mark, the exclamation point, the colon kind of hovers, the semicolon kind of hovers, maybe it touches the ground, the parenthesis. There's a whole bunch. The two most common ones are going to be the ones that we've got here first. We're circling those marks of punctuation. The only thing that might be a little bit different is, the capital letter at the beginning of a sentence is going to get circled. So, if, there's a capital S at the beginning of the sentence, we're going to consider that a mark of punctuation as well. I'll show you in just a moment what that looks like. Free modifiers get highlighted, and we're going to draw arrows toward what those free modifiers modify. So the arrows are toward the modification. In these steps, I'll show you what it looks like in this first sentence. In this case, we've got a sentence that reads like this. It says, Livy helped clean up her own party, wiping spilled lemonade, gathering sandwich crusts, and sweeping cookie crumbs from the floor. In this single sentence right here, if these were steps, it sounds like it could be true that, right? I mean, the base clause passes the it could be true that test because usually somebody does something or something does something. It's got the subject and it's got the verb in it. In this case, it sounds like it could be true that Livy helped clean up her own party. It could be true that Livy helped clean up her own party. There's the subject and there's the verb. Look, they're right next to one another. It's like I told you about in the little love story right here. The marks of punctuation, the capital L at the beginning of the sentence is considered a mark of punctuation. And then we have all these commas and a period at the end of the sentence. You need a period to complete the sentence. As far as free modifiers go, you ask yourself like, well, it looks like between this mark and this mark, that's the point, is that free modifiers are set off by marks of punctuation, meaning this mark of punctuation and this mark of punctuation indicate free modifier. So you say to yourself, well, who is it that's wiping spilled lemonade? And this arrow, we're talking about Livy. Libby help wipe the spilled lemonade. You know, who's gathering the sandwich crust? This free modifier between that mark of punctuation and this upcoming mark of punctuation. Who's gathering sandwich crust? You know, Libby is. Goes back and modifies Libby, that free modifier does. And then finally, we've got a third free modifier between that mark of punctuation and the period at the end of the sentence. And you say to yourself, well, who is it that's sweeping cookie crumbs from the floor? All of these free modifiers go back and modify the subject, Libby. It's a really common theme. One more, and I'll give you a chance to try some out on your own. It looks like we've got a sentence that reads like this: rusted from being left out in the winter weather. The lawnmower gave Stephanie a hard time this spring, coughing and spitting the first 7 pulls of the cord, and finally moaning to a grumbled start on the 8th. And it sounds like it could be true that usually something does something or somebody does something. In this case, it could be true that the lawnmower gave Stephanie a hard time this spring. It could be true that the lawnmower gave Stephanie a hard time this spring. It could be true that the lawnmower gave Stephanie a hard time this spring. Marks of punctuation, capital letter, mark, 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 mark. You might say to yourself, well, you know, what is it that's being rusted, or what's been rusted from being left out in the winter weather? And this free modifier here between this mark of punctuation and this capital letter, it's a free modifier. It modifies the lawnmower. It doesn't pass the "it could be true that" test. It could be true that rusted from being left out in the winter weather. We don't have anything that does anything. You can hear that it sounds incomplete. It's incomplete on purpose because it's not the base clause, it's a free modifier. Between this mark of punctuation after the base clause, coughing and spitting the first 7 pulls of the cord, you know, that doesn't modify Stephanie. It goes back and modifies the lawnmower. Finally, moaning to a grumbled start on the 8th, the 8th try, that is. We got 3 free modifiers. It looks like all 3 of them go back and modify the subject, lawnmower. And these are our first steps in analyzing some sentences. Look, as you try these 3 out on your own, you can pause the video in just a moment, but I will say that, you know, number 5 gets tricky. The base clause gets interrupted a little bit, but we have a subject here, Alexis, who searched a sea of faces for her mommy and aunt. So the base clause is broken up in number 5, but if you try 3 and 4 and 5, based on what you saw in 1 and 2, now would be a good time for you to pause the video. Okay, great. If you pause the video, then you probably saw that in number 3, it could be true that Johnson stood at the corner of North Baldwin and Stevens Streets. The subject, Johnson, what did he do? He stood, marks of punctuation, comma, 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 period. You know, who's dressed in his Sunday best clothes? Chances are that a common theme, you can see that this goes back and modifies whoever Johnson is. Who's carefully washing down a street vendor hot dog with a cold Mountain Dew? That modifies Johnson as well. And you can see these free modifiers, mark of punctuation, shared mark of punctuation, and another mark of punctuation for the second free modifier that we just took a look at. And then last but not least, waiting to be picked up from school, this free modifier right here between these 2 marks of punctuation, you know, they both modify Johnson. It's a really common theme that free modifiers go back and modify the subject in the base clause. Number 4, could be true that the dragon was all stillness. Some verbs are not action verbs. In this case, was, like is, was, were, are. Those kinds of verbs, known as state of being verbs, are still verbs. In this case, that one's a little challenging. free modifier and free modifier. These two free modifiers, you can see them right between marks of punctuation. That's the whole point of free modifiers, is that they're between marks of punctuation. You know, they both go back and they modify the dragon. And then last but not least, looks like mark of punctuation. This free modifier right here, wiping tears away with the back of her hand. You can see it modifies Alexis. Feeling more panicked with every passing second. Also modifies Alexis. Looks like I missed some marks of punctuation here. Sorry. But that's what number 5 would look like once you get through all the steps that we've introduced so far. Yeah, hey, that's page 2. So page 1 and page 2. In the next video, you'll find the notes for pages 3 and 4.